So part of using the table saw effectively is having good control. Having good control typically means using some kind of push device to get your material through the saw. We have 3 different push devices that you'll see in our shop. One of them we never ever want you to use on the table saw, and that's one of these. This is a push pad. They're really good for planers and they're really good for router tables, but for the table saw they're terrible. They don't have your hands far enough away from the material. They don't protect you in the terms of kickback. They're just really quite dangerous. So never ever use one of these on the table saw. When you are using the table saw, we really have 2 recommended devices. We have push sticks. We buy these for about $8 a piece, the plastic ones, or you can just make wooden ones. Please don't cut into them if you don't have to, but if you do, don't stress out too much. These are what you use 90% of the time in terms of just getting material through the saw safely. This is a push shoe. Push shoes are really good for sheet material and for long material because they have this heel back here that you use to push and this face which we use to bear down on the material and make sure it stays flat to the table. They also have a little nose up here typically for using like a push stick. Push shoes are really useful. They keep your hand nice and far away from the blade. So we do recommend that you use these quite a bit. One of the rules we have in the shop, and this is one of those rules that's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's a great rule of thumb for everyone to keep in mind, and especially for newbies, is we have the rule of 10. The rule of 10 says is that if your hand is within 10 centimeters of the blade, or if part of the saw, say a fence, is within 10 centimeters of the blade, you have to use a sacrificial surface or a push device. So if the fence here is within 10 centimeters of the blade, you have to use a sacrificial fence. If you're going to have your hands close enough to the blade that you're going to be within 10 centimeters, we want you to use push devices to control that rather than your hands. One of the big rules with a table saw is never ever, 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 ever make a freehand cut. A freehand cut is any kind of cut where you don't have some kind of reference face or control surface for your material. So if I just got a random piece of lumber and just passed it through the saw, didn't use any of the fences, didn't use any controls, didn't make a jig, anything like that, that's really unsafe and you should never do it. You see people on YouTube do it sometimes. Bad idea. We don't want to ever see it in the shop. If we see you doing it in the shop, we'll probably have to talk about consequences because it risks your safety, it risks the safety of everyone around you and so on. We have had people do all sorts of crazy things in here. I walked into a member one time trying to cut some firewood, and he had a log of firewood and he had the blade at full extension, so like 5 inches of cutting, and he had the piece of firewood on the surface like this and he was trying to resaw it down the middle. And had he just rotated slightly to either direction, that thing would have just picked it straight up and thrown it right into his chest because he was right behind the blade. Super dangerous. That was a great example of when it's okay to tell someone to stop, so I asked him very politely, okay, can you turn the saw off? And we had a chat about the risks involved in what he was doing. What he could have done, or what he should have done, and what he later did, is make a jig. So, getting some plywood and everything else and building something that he can secure his material to so that it, passes through the saw in a continuous straight line. So there's no risk of tilting, twisting, all the things that come along with a freehand cut. So never ever make a freehand cut on the table saw. Always build a jig or use a fence or do something along those lines. What's really important when it comes to operating the table saw safely is focus and control. So focus is making sure that you're 100% focused on operating the saw while it's on. Don't think about the next step in your project. Don't think about what you're going to have for lunch. Don't think about anything else that's stressing you out in life. It's really important that the only thing that you're thinking about when you're operating the saw is the saw itself. The other important factor is control. If you don't have full control of what you're doing, if you if your cut is unstable in some way, if you don't have the right push device, you need to stop and reassess. 100% control is really important to safe operation. If you don't have 100% control, you're not operating the saw correctly. So make sure you've got the right push devices, build a jig, use a sled, use the right fence for the job, secure your material in the correct way so that you've got 100% control, focus on what you're doing, and you should be safe 90% of the time. So before operating the saw, it's really important that you make sure that you're ready to operate and that you're wearing all the right gear. So the first things you make sure is you make sure that you're wearing closed shoes, with good grip, and if you've got steel caps or some sort of protective caps, then wear those. We want you to remove all rings and jewelry. We don't want you to have a degloving incident or something like that. Silicone rings and silicone watch bands are fine, but everything else needs to come off. We want you to wear eye and or face protection. We want you to wear respiratory protection. So if you have a P2 dust mask or a respirator or something like that, please wear it. We provide some dust masks in the shop. Tie back any long hair that you have. Make sure that nothing's going to get caught in the machine. And restrain your clothing. So if you're wearing long sleeves, make sure that there's nothing baggy that's going to get caught in the machine. Don't wear any sort of loose fitting clothes, that sort of thing. You want it to be nice and contained so you don't get caught on the machine. So with anything in the shop, any piece of wood that you're going to pass through one of our machines, it's really important that if you don't know the provenance of the material, that you metal detect it. Provenance of the material is where it came from. So if you went to Bunnings and you bought a sheet of plywood from Bunnings and you came straight here and you put it on the machine, it's probably fine. Anything else, if you've left it on site overnight, if you got it secondhand, if you've got any kind of like reclaimed lumber, anything like that, it has to get metal detected. You don't know what's in there. We have a metal detector. It's very easy to use. There's a separate little video course on how to use that, and it's a requirement for this course that you've done it. But we're just reminding you here that everything goes through the saw. If you don't know the provenance, it has to get metal detected.